So thank you very much. We'll ask all the speakers to come up, sit here, and we'll try to encourage folks in the audience to ask some questions. Please.
Hello, I'm Analia Porras from the ones who joined us from PACO, and I thank you very much for very related and diverse talk. I have between a comment and a question. I'm actually very happy to hear that both the group from Chile, which I didn't know about, the congratulations, it's very exciting. I knew the one from Argentina because I was involved in the Benznidazole uptake by the strategic fund. And I think these are two good examples of programs that are setting from the R&D, they are setting access program. If I understand, Chile is setting an agreement with the Ministry of Health to have that vaccine eventually accessible through the vaccination. And in the case of Benznidazole, before they started producing, they started having conversations with PACO to have it full procured by the strategic fund. And so the reflection is if you can elaborate a little bit on the thinking and kind of challenge some of the other speakers, with, especially coming from the middle income perspective, and Dr. Gadelia, Dr. Carlos probably knows this too. Middle income countries get the one squeeze like the ham in the sandwich because we don't have the access prices that Gilead might put on, in which neither we have the money to pay the high cost medicines. And in the case of Gilead, as well as Iteration, the only alternative for access to Hep C was joint negotiation by countries to get down the price to a price that was at least something that the health budget can include. So I would like you, if you can, from your own point of view, elaborate a little bit of what can governments, universities, and research institutions, but also pharmaceuticals do to link from the beginning R&D to access to all, not to specific groups that I think they're very difficult to determine who's poor and who's not poor within a context, especially of very many countries in our region that are so inequitable. So I'm sorry.
Yes.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I agree with you that the strategy that Gilead employed in sub-Saharan Africa is not particularly well suited to middle-income countries. And in middle-income countries, I think that intra-country price discrimination may be an effective strategy. So trying to create a dual marketing strategy where there are very similar drugs that are branded differently and have different channels of distribution, and then try to fight against physical arbitrage and informational arbitrage to allow for that kind of a dual channel distribution mechanism. The other thing I would say is that to the extent that the drugs are developed in partnership with some kind of a charitable entity or some kind of a governmental or some kind of a governmental or intergovernmental organization, I think that it's very important to put access provisions into the contracting at the front end so that there is an obligation to the extent that charitable money was part of the structure for funding the R&D, that the public gets the benefit of the fruits of that research. So the desire to make sure that the inventors can recoup their investment in their research and development is much less acute because in a lot of cases then that's going to be government money, that's going to be charitable money that led to the development of that drug. In those cases, we should bake in those access provisions at the very front. And so one of the places that we've talked is working with folks like Gates or like the Global Fund as they develop these kinds of research streams to make sure, or SAPI, that make sure that at the front end it is absolutely clear that we're going to have access to those medicines to the poor populations.
Could I make a comment for those of us who sort of late in our careers started working outside of the U.S. or in international programs, the notion of what is a developing country, etc. I have a homework assignment for everyone. Look up a guy who died a year ago named Hans Rosling. So he was a epidemiologist and professor of global health at Karolinska. He has some of the nicest presentations and a book out recently on what developing low-income, middle-income means, how that's changing worldwide, and how it has changed over the last 20 years in beautifully graphic format. So it's Hans Rosling. The book just came out called Factfulness, and there's 3 TED Talks over the last 10 years about it. But the point for this discussion is to try and convince the pharma industry, particularly the pharma industry based in the U.S. and North America and Europe, that where markets will grow is in the parts of the world that, like Latin America, like East Asia, like Africa in the next 20 years, and that economically for those companies not restricting themselves to pricing structures and markets based on where they make their money now, namely Europe and North America, it's in their interest to do so, because if you look at where both world population and world wealth will be, it will be in many of those other places. But the way to read about it for those of us who don't do this for a living is Hans Rosling, Factfulness. It's a book out recently. Yes?
I have another question to Ignacio. Thank you very much to all the panel for interesting presentations. But Ignacio, I was particularly intrigued by your presentation, first of all, the role of Mundo Sano. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on the funds that come to Mundo Sano. I know that big other pharmaceutical companies have created their foundation, for instance, Novartis Foundation, Pfizer Foundation. And I was wondering, is Mundo Sano playing a similar role as a foundation to a larger pharmaceutical company, or is it funded differently? And perhaps you can elaborate a little on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing is, I wanted to ask you specifically about something very interesting, which I think plays a role somehow in what was just said about low and middle and high income countries, which is now an access plan within the US. I think we usually don't hear about access plans within the US. I think it plays an important role in Chagas because you're talking about people that do not have health insurance. We're talking about undocumented immigrants. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the access plan that you're thinking about developing together with Harvard.
Right.
I'm not sure if it's a School of Public Health or medical school, but what is in this access plan that particularly takes into consideration the undocumented immigrants which do not have necessarily health insurance? Thank you.
Right. Thanks for the question. The second one, really interesting. I don't have much information about that because it's a work that has just started. But basically the idea is to work with Harvard University. We were talking a couple of weeks ago to Michael Reich, who came to Argentina. We're starting to try to come up with an idea to create between us an access plan that could be effective, because, like you said, there are large pockets of people with the disease that are unidentified, and a big problem is also, like you mentioned, a cultural problem where these undocumented people maybe don't go to healthcare centers because they're afraid that they're going to get deported. So that's a work in progress, and it's something that is just beginning. But the idea is that the Professor Reich is going to help us develop an access plan, and there's a doctoral fellow that works with him that is going to start working with us for a couple of years in order to generate a truly efficacious access plan for the United States, funded with the money from, like I mentioned, from the priority review voucher. Going to your first question, Mundo Sano is the foundation of Insud Pharma. So that's where they get the money from. And it tries to be, I mean, for most of its activities, it tries to be self-sustaining. But once we, for example, with the FDA example, once they decided that they were going to try to get benznidazole approved in the U.S., then it was interesting how the mission and vision statement of a pharmaceutical company who wants to make a profit can realign with the mission and vision statement of the foundation who wants to make treatment accessible to the people who need it and at a low price. So really, for the past 3 or 4 years, Insud Pharma has been not only contributing with money to the foundation, but lawyers, human resources, regulatory affairs people. I mean, most of the back office from Insud Pharma has been working together with the foundation to get this medicine approved here in the U.S.
A follow-up question to that. The priority review voucher that you mentioned, those have sold for as much as $350 million.
Mm-hmm.
Recent ones in the $100 million range.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know whether you could share the development costs for benzoyl. And then for the panel as a whole, I'm interested to know what you think about the priority review voucher program. And when you have the majority of companies who receive these might not have public interest uses in mind of that 150 or so million. Is this a program that we want to continue?
Mm-hmm. About the cost, this has been a work that has been done for the past 6 or 7 years. Most of the investment has been in salaries of the people working on this, synthesis of the compound, and then most of the expenditure, I guess, was on the FDA approval. But I would say in the order of, I don't know, maybe $5 million, something like that.
May I add something to
Yeah.
the company? Because when they started, they didn't know they would end up in
Right,
the FDA,
right.
and they were doing it for Latin America, and they based the price that they saw it through the Papa Strategic Fund, which was on a cost recovery basis, and it was higher than the original La Pepe's subsidized one, but it was affordable still to country.
Yeah, so for this medicine, maybe it tells a good story of how the priority review voucher worked. I guess what I'm asking the panel as a whole, the bigger picture about whether this makes sense. If we have $150 million return just on the priority review voucher, not considering revenues, or a $5 million investment.
I mean, I'll just make one comment. I know, I guess implicit in your question is that there's some mixed feelings and, sort of mixed opinions about the program. And I had heard that maybe somebody else will know for sure, but the healthcare economist that had originally developed the model for this has said that he now has sort of had some mixed feelings about it as well, that there are questions. But I mean, I think the preponderance of opinion is that it has been effective, at least within the U.S., of generating new products for indications that otherwise would not have, drugs would not exist today on that side. I think, one of the areas that I'm most involved with some of my projects in is in the area of antibiotics. And while it hasn't really, there's variations of that, obviously, for antibiotics, but really a full-fledged program like this, either a back-end, like a TEV, right, a transferable exclusivity voucher, or some major market entry reward, those are the things that are really being considered for antibiotics. And I think something like that will be needed, So I guess my answer, although it's, it's a little bit of a caveated answer, is that I think it's been a good tool. I mean, I agree it raises some eyebrows when they've sold for, $350 million plus. But I do think it's been a good tool, and that something like that will be necessary in other areas that, I think everybody in this room knows that we face pretty significant risk in the antibiotics field, that there's not development of new antibiotics. So there's going to have to be something. If not PRVs, then something will need to be done really to encourage antibiotics research.
I've spent less time in the FDA context than in the patent system context. I was very involved in the development of the Patents for Humanity program, which has a little bit of a similar thought process. I guess my thought in that sense is that because of the overall structural underinvestment in research and development for the set of disease categories that primarily affect the poor, we do need to experiment with mechanisms like prizes, challenges, grant mechanisms, pull mechanisms to try to both reward and incentivize investments at the front end in the kinds of things that we think are socially beneficial. So I think experimenting with models that take advantage of some of the levers that we have within the bureaucratic system to make it lucrative for folks, make it lucrative, create some kind of a carrot that we can then dangle in front of inventors to try to get them to use their technologies for socially beneficial issues is a good thought process. Whether the priority review voucher process has succeeded in that, I won't sort of opine, but I do think that we need to use pull mechanisms as a way of trying to push inventors in that direction. And just one other caveat to that, I tried to work with Congress to make the Patents for Humanity vouchers transferable in order to create a little bit more of a monetary incentive there, because the way that it works within the patent system is mostly an acknowledgement and something that has some benefit on the PR side, but having a little bit more of financial incentive there, I think would be helpful.
I'd like to make a comment.
Please.
I think we need to change our business model, because it's not so easy to separate the disease for the poor and the disease for the rich. For example, in Brazil, the first cause of mortality is heart disease, is circulatory disease. The second is cancer. There is not more a world that tropical disease is from the poor and chronic disease is from the rich.
Right.
Cancer is
Absolutely.
a problem,
Yes.
a world problem, and you must attack it. And we may change the business model. The experience in Brazil is very interesting in this aspect. For example, in negotiation with Merck and Novartis, we can, I will joke, we walk from a license, compulsory license with Merck to a partnership to produce HPV in a cooperative way, offering to all adolescent that needs it. With Novartis, the drugs for cancer disease, they reduce the price 50%, and they how can I say, they amplify the market a lot. Then it is a win-win game, a cooperative game. Then I think nowadays we must change the way the state organizes itself, institution, but also the way the strategies of the big companies organize itself. And we have experience that it's possible, but the state and the institution must know where they want to go to negotiate. And I think it's possible. Only to finish, Veronica in the morning talked to us about the cooperation, the Latin American cooperation. This event is also to discuss Latin America. We make cooperation to have access with this company, access in terms of health and in terms of knowledge and technology. I think it's possible to establish this kind of cooperation considering the Latin American perspective.
Yes.
If I may be permitted to ask a couple of questions, actually, one for Quentin and one for Curtis. I think the promise of what you articulated seems immense. My question is, do you see this as sort of something that can be applied systematically and sustainably across a range of conditions and products and so on, as opposed to one-off conditions where I think we have examples of where it has succeeded So, and if so, if you could give some examples of how this has been, applied in that manner. And a question for you, Curtis. I mean, I was fascinated by what you're doing within the Harvard community. But if you were to extend this model to apply across institutions around the world with the same concept, how might the business model need to change in order to effectively have that happen to bring that to fruition?
So I think that the answer is yes, that it can be expanded to a lot more conditions. I think that if you're talking about non-exclusive generic licensing partnerships of the kind that Gilead employed in the context of HIV/AIDS drugs, those are primarily going to work best in the very poorest countries and in sets of circumstances where there's a fair amount of donor funding. And as to, there was a question about what we think about the trajectory of some of the very poorest countries. And I do think that, if you're thinking about the longer-term plans of the commercial firms, they do see those as potentially profit centers. And so one of the things that you need to think about is how do you think about timelines so that you say, look, this is a model that works pretty well during a period of time where you weren't going to get to that market anyway, to create a distribution mechanism. But, we're going to sunset that, or you're going to transition to a different model if the development trajectory of the countries reaches the point where it's going to be a commercially viable market without donor funding for those entities. So I think that that's, in terms of the non-exclusive licensing partnerships, there is a relatively finite set of circumstances where that's going to make sense, but it is much broader than where it's actually been used. With respect to intra-country differential pricing, I do think that this is a model that is expandable to a number of different disease categories, a number of different commercial firms, and where you could see considerable expansion of that practice. The place where it has worked most robustly has been with Novartis in the malaria context, and they ran a series of programs that were differentiating even with the same geographic areas where they were charging different prices for different branded products, but that were essentially the same active mechanism. I think that this is a set of practices that's actually used a little bit more broadly than we know, because there is not an incentive for the commercial firms to tell us all of the circumstances where they've experimented with these strategies. There's a lot of difficulties with transparency. We don't know about the reimbursement rate negotiations that pharmaceutical companies engage with a number of different companies for reasons that make a lot of sense. And so actually I think that there are a lot more experiments out there than are sort of publicly known. But I do think that this notion of being able to charge different prices for different people within the same jurisdiction both is expandable and also is especially important in countries where you have both an affluent population that the companies want to exploit, and an impoverished population that's potentially dying for lack of access to those medicines. We need to think about more how we're going to allow for dual pricing within the same jurisdiction. And I do think it can be expanded, and it can be a win-win where the commercial firms can actually exploit the affluent markets, and we can still effectuate the public health goals of a charitable program.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I want to add something to what you just say. Well, in Latin America, that is happening actually, because the companies sell to the public sector, to the government in one price, or to the private sector another, and not just two prices.
Sure, there can be many,
prices.
many tiers, yeah.
So it's happening already in most Latin American countries, and it will be interesting to evaluate how well that works. That's the next step. We have an experience, we need to evaluate it.
And one of the research questions is how can we, as an academic community, de-risk the kinds of strategies by, I think there's a belief within the pharmaceutical firms that physical arbitrage is more of a challenge than in fact it has to be, that information arbitrage can't be navigated. And I think that one of the things that we've tried to do as academics is sort of think about how we can optimize these kinds of strategies so that companies can feel a little bit more, more likely to lean in to doing something that can be commercially viable and sustainable, and can also reinforce an R&D structure that will allow for the next wave of innovation, while at the same time enabling the public health benefits.
So I'll give a relatively short answer to that. I mean, I think it's certainly true that there may be different solutions in different parts of the world to doing something like what we do here at Harvard. I think that the thing that usually comes up is, well, where are you going to get the money in the first place to start a program like this, right? We were fortunate that Harvard, there's a great tradition of giving, from Harvard alumni, and so this was a philanthropic gift to run this. But, a lot of the programs that I've seen started around the world, in some cases, so for example, in Australia, there's BioCurate in Melbourne, which is Melbourne University and Monash. The two of them got together. They both put in money from the university coffers to start something that's larger scale than what I have, actually. So that's one source of money. Also, I travel, within, I know, for example, in Osaka University and also in Spain, there are cases where almost as much money has been put in by local regional governments into these programs. So in Osaka, it was kind of the greater city, and in Catalonia specifically, where I'm thinking, also in Spain, where they're doing things. So there are different sources of the money. I think the other part of it is not just where does the money come from, but when I talk about the ecosystem, which are the pieces that are really missing in different places. I think a lot of this, it's interesting to the extent to which the global marketplace applies, actually. And so, if your outcome that you're looking for is going to be directly licensing to existing established pharmaceutical companies, then, the global search and evaluation capabilities of those companies is such that I'm not sure it really makes all that much difference that you're, in Boston. Now, of course, there's some proximity effect, but I think if you're able to get compounds or vaccines perhaps or other biomedical technologies to the right stage, then there is the potential to do partnerships around those really to a large extent regardless of where you are. If what your goal is startup companies, then that's more complicated because the venture community is not as well established everywhere. And more importantly, I guess I didn't really articulate it on the slide, is the business entrepreneurs and the people that often are going to be needed to really launch the startup company in conjunction with the investors. And that is true. I think that's one thing that I think is a challenge when I see I've gone back to meet with the people in Japan, for example, and they really don't have as much of a tradition of business entrepreneurs in Japan. So I think that would be a challenge, but I think that then from the perspective of the university, you might just think of it in terms of, well, we won't be as focused on startups as our exit point. We'll be more focused on licenses and partnerships with, maybe it's Japanese pharmaceutical companies, maybe it's global companies.
So I have a question that's principally, I'm Aaron Malas from the Fletcher School at Tufts. My question is principally for Dr. Gadelha. About the Brazilian experience, but I'd also be curious to hear about the U.S. experience from Mr. Palfrey. And that's about the role of industry associations in pharma, and particularly not just cooperation with industry, but cooperation in industry between firms, particularly when it comes to influencing the policy decisions that get made. Do you view them more as facilitators or as more of an impediment to innovation in some of the questions that you're talking about? In the Brazilian case, I'd be particularly curious about how you see the difference between, say, Interpharma on the one hand, which is the sort of pharmaceutical research, a little bit more like pharma in the U.S. context, versus some of the local associations, domestic companies, how you view that dynamic between multinationals and domestic firms that are sort of cooperating amongst one another to try to influence industrial policy for pharmaceuticals in certain situations. And in the U.S. context, I'd be curious to know if in your time at OSTP you had interaction with pharma in particular, and sort of what role you view them playing, both here but also in terms of U.S. drugs reaching other markets.
I have two comments about that. First, for my surprise, the private firms that participate in this program, the program began with less than 5 companies, and it increased to more than 100 projects, different projects involving cancer, neglect disease, and so on. And 50% of the 50% of the partnership was established with big pharma companies. It was not only a closed model, but at the same time, we, how can I say, direct cooperative way to have access to the Brazilian market. The market is the most powerful instrument to incentive innovation and technological development. More important than finance, than taxes. Market is the key solution. Then use the market to establish this kind of cooperation, and it was balanced for our surprise, and it was very well accepted. But the second question, more general, I want to tell you, is that we have to assume, being an economist, competition is good. Competition is good for innovation, is good for the price, is good for diversity of approach. Monopoly and the oligopoly is not good. We learn it all the time in economics. And in the practice, we forget it. We forget it. Then startup is very good, but not only to be acquired for the big companies, to have new companies to compete in the market. Mm-hmm. The less development countries has the right to be competitive, but cooperating, not in an old-fashioned way of thinking industrial policy. I'm completely, we finished that period to close the market and so on. But at the same time, we have to remember our first class in economics, that competition is good. It's good for innovation, to stimulate, to have a stick and a carrot. Then I think thinking this way, we can stimulate competition as a way to stimulate access and innovation.
In the U.S. Political context, I mean, let me make 2 observations. One is that one of the things that I observed was an extremely polarized dialogue between the sort of private sector and the advocacy community. And a lot of the conversations that I was involved in were very unproductive, where, you know, there was a lot of acrimony, there wasn't a lot of collaboration. And I thought that there was a very important role for voices that would say, let's set aside the question of radical change, of huge new investments by Congress, you know, sort of large changes to the intellectual property structure, you know, and it's important to think big. But let's set aside for the moment the question of what we would do if we were creating the system from scratch, and try to think about whether there are things within the current structure where if we work together, we can actually save a lot of lives. And I think most of the way that I think about access to medicines and research and development for disease categories that primarily affect the poor is what are the scalable solutions? And most of the scalable solutions involve having folks within industry at the table. Even the very largest charities and even the largest intergovernmental organizations can only do things at one scale. If you want to go to we're talking about tens of millions of people who lack access to very basic meds. And so if you're talking about how you want to design solutions at that scale in this political environment, I think you do want to have pharma at the table in some way. And I think in terms of characteristics of the industry as a whole, I mean, I think it's like any other large group of people. I think that there are some really innovative and forward-looking people who are really trying to improve global public health, and there's some folks who have a more entrenched entrenched way of thinking. I think one of the things you want to think about as a public policy professional is how do you empower and facilitate and sort of give, put some wind at the backs of the kinds of people who want to develop solutions that are effective. So I do think that the program that Gilead did with respect to HIV/AIDS saved a lot of lives, and in some ways was more effective than some of the corporate social responsibility programs that were based on a more traditional model. I think some of what Novartis was doing in the malaria space was pretty interesting, and I do think that some of the opportunities to contribute intellectual property into research collaboratives could solve some of the problems we saw in Ebola. So I do think that there's good behavior within that industry, and that one of the things we ought to do with the priority review vouchers or patents for humanity or any other kind of program that you develop is how do you incentivize the kind of behavior that you think is going to be socially beneficial and try to expand the best practices.
Also, I published an article called Why Price Discrimination is Increasingly the Wrong Solution to the Global Drug Problem. I had the opportunity to present this to the World Trade Organization in 2011. By the way, they're all very receptive to your proposal, I think based on their experience with the HIV medicines and how those have been distributed around the world using price discrimination. But one of the problems, and there are many, in addition to arbitrage, is the issue of placing the burden on patients. It makes sense to have wealthier people pay more, but why would you have wealthier people with terminal illnesses, with serious illnesses, pay more? Why not have that monetary collection mechanism take place through the tax system as opposed to placing that burden on patients?
So if you want my personal view, I think that it would be terrific if you could create a universal health program that was structured radically differently from the way that most public health systems are structured. I think that the question is, what's the path from here to there in any kind of a realistic timeline, in any kind of a realistic political scenario. So I think you're absolutely right that that would be a better way to do it. But I think that you do, to some extent, at least in the time scale of decades, want to accept some structural realities in terms of what you're dealing with. Let me also mention, when we're talking about differential pricing, people often, and I know you're not doing this, but people do often confuse the kind of tiered pricing that we do across countries with the kind of tiered pricing that you would do within countries. So let me just make a definitional distinction. In most disease categories, there is tiered pricing where where the price that is charged in the very poorest countries is different from the price that is charged in a slightly wealthier set of countries is different from the set of prices that are charged in the very wealthiest countries. And in some ways that does save lives. In some ways that actually has some challenges that exist, and some ways in which I think that's not an optimal structure. That's a little different from what we're talking about here, which is trying to create dual channels within the same mechanism. I mean, I think my bottom line answer to your question is that if I had control of all of the legislative bodies in the world, and if I could magically fix international treaty agreements, I think you would want to go in a different kind of an incentive structure. There also are ways in which I would change the world patent systems. But I do think if you're talking about something that can be accomplished within a current sort of political structure that could save a lot of lives, I think that intra-country differential pricing in a lot of contexts is a good way to go.
I'd like to thank the speakers and the audience for a wonderful discussion. Thanks very much.